The gaslight flickered across the marble floors of the Davis auction house. It cast dancing shadows that seemed to mock Eleanor Hartley as she stood frozen before the assembled crowd. At 28, she had believed herself beyond the reach of her past, beyond the humiliation that had defined her early 20s when she had been nothing more than a pawn in her family's desperate financial games. Yet here she stood, her hands trembling inside her worn gloves. The one man she had hoped never to see again stepped forward from the crowd with the confidence of someone who believed everything and everyone had a price. Gareth Watts had not changed in the 5 years since their engagement had ended in spectacular fashion. He still carried himself with the arrogant assurance of old money. His blonde hair was perfectly arranged, his tailcoat cut to emphasize broad shoulders that had once made her foolish young heart flutter. Now, looking at him, she felt only a cold, hollow dread. He surveyed the room with calculating eyes, his gaze finally settling on her with something that might have been triumph or possession. The auction house had seemed like salvation when Eleanor had first entered its employment 6 months ago. After her father's death and the subsequent revelation that the Hartley fortune existed only in carefully maintained appearances, she had found herself with few options for respectable work. Her mother had retreated to a distant cousin's estate in Scotland, her health broken by the scandal and shame. Eleanor had remained in London, determined to forge some kind of life from the wreckage. The auction house, with its need for someone educated and refined to catalogue estate sales, had provided exactly that. She had thought herself safe in this world of dusty paintings and forgotten heirlooms, invisible among the shadows of other people's histories. She had been wrong. The evening had begun ordinarily enough, with the usual collection of minor aristocracy and wealthy merchants gathering to bid on the contents of the late Earl of Pembroke's estate. Eleanor had stood to one side as she always did, her notebook in hand, ready to record the winning bids. She had not expected Gareth to appear, had not imagined he would still move in circles that overlapped with her drastically reduced circumstances. When his eyes had first found her across the crowded room, she had seen his surprise. It was followed quickly by something far more disturbing. Recognition, yes, but also a spark of interest that made her skin crawl with the memory of why she had broken their engagement all those years ago. The auction had proceeded through lot after lot, paintings and furniture and silver services changing hands with the rhythmic precision of the auctioneer's gavel. Eleanor had performed her duties mechanically, her awareness uncomfortably fixed on Gareth's presence near the back of the room. She noted the way his gaze returned to her again and again. She had hoped he would lose interest, would remember some pressing engagement, and depart before the evening's end. Instead, he had waited until the final lot had been sold, until the crowd had begun to disperse. Then he had moved through the thinning assembly with deliberate purpose, his path bringing him inexorably to where she stood arranging her papers with hands that had begun to shake. "Eleanor," he had said, his voice carrying the same smooth charm that had once deceived her into thinking him kind. "How unexpected to find you here in such circumstances." She had straightened her spine, calling upon every ounce of dignity she possessed. "Mr. Watts," she had replied, her tone carefully neutral. "I trust you enjoyed the auction." His smile had been sharp, predatory. "Oh, I found it most illuminating," he had said, his gaze travelling over her in a way that made her feel stripped of the modest armour of her dark blue dress. "Tell me, Eleanor, are you happy in this new life of yours? Working among the detritus of failed estates, recording the dissolution of once proud families?" The cruelty of the observation had been intentional, a reminder that her own family's fall from grace was recent enough to still sting. Before she could formulate a response, he had continued, his voice dropping to a tone that only she could hear. "I've been thinking about you, actually. About us. About what we once had. It was a mistake, you know, ending our engagement. You were young, frightened by responsibilities you didn't understand. But I'm willing to forgive all that." Eleanor had felt ice spreading through her veins, "There is nothing to forgive," she had said quietly. "I ended our engagement because you were cruel, because you treated me as property to be acquired and managed. I have no regrets about that decision." His expression had hardened then, the charming mask slipping to reveal the coldness beneath. "No regrets? Look at you, Eleanor, working for wages, living in what I imagine must be shabby rooms somewhere respectable people would be embarrassed to visit. Your mother is in exile. Your name is ruined. Your prospects are non-existent. And yet you claim to have no regrets?" She had opened her mouth to respond when he had played his final card. He raised his voice just enough that nearby conversations faltered, heads beginning to turn in their direction. "I'm prepared to make you an offer," he had announced, his tone that of a man proposing a business transaction. "Come back to me, Eleanor. Marry me as you should have done 5 years ago. I'll restore your mother to society. I'll pay off whatever debts your father left behind. I'll give you back everything you've lost. Name your price." The gasps that had rippled through the room had been audible, shock and fascination spreading as quickly as flame through dry tinder. Eleanor had stood paralysed, horror and humiliation washing over her in waves as she realised what Gareth had done. By making his proposal public, by framing it as a transaction complete with the offer to pay whatever price she demanded, he had reduced her to the level of the auction lots that had just been sold. She was no longer a woman but a commodity to be haggled over, her worth to be determined by negotiation and exchange of funds. "I am not for sale," she had whispered, but her voice had been too quiet, too shaken to carry beyond the immediate circle of observers. Gareth had smiled then, the expression coldly triumphant. "Everything is for sale, Eleanor," he had replied. "You've simply never understood that fundamental truth. But very well, if you need time to consider, I'll play along." He had turned to address the assembled onlookers, all pretense of privacy abandoned. "I offer £10,000, he had declared, his voice ringing through the now silent auction house. £10,000 for Eleanor Hartley's hand in marriage, for the restoration of her family's name and position. Surely that's generous enough to overcome any lingering girlish scruples. The room had erupted in whispers, voices blending into an indistinguishable murmur of shock and speculation. Eleanor had felt the walls closing in, felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her, calculating her worth, judging whether Gareth's offer was fair. She had wanted to run, to flee into the London night and never stop. But her legs would not obey, her body frozen in place by the magnitude of her humiliation. That was when the voice had come from the shadows near the entrance. It was deep and cold and carried an authority that cut through the chaos like a blade. "She is not for sale at any price," the voice had said. "Kindly remove yourself from this establishment before I have you forcibly ejected." The crowd had parted, revealing a figure Eleanor had not noticed enter. The man who emerged into the light of the chandeliers was tall, his presence commanding attention without apparent effort. He was perhaps 35, dressed in evening clothes of such exquisite tailoring that they spoke of wealth beyond Gareth's merely comfortable fortune. His dark hair was swept back from a face that was all sharp planes and angles, handsome in a severe way that suggested little tolerance for foolishness. But it was his eyes that held Eleanor's attention, grey as winter storms and fixed on Gareth with an expression of such withering contempt that even Watts took an involuntary step backward. "Your Grace," Gareth had managed, his voice uncertain for the first time that evening. "I was merely conducting a private conversation." "Nothing about your proposal appeared private," the Duke had replied, his tone arctic. "You have publicly humiliated this lady by treating her as though she were chattel to be purchased. You will apologise immediately and depart, or I will ensure that every door in London society is closed to you by morning." Eleanor had stared at the Duke, recognition slowly filtering through her shock. Alexander Northbrook, the Duke of Millbrook, was a figure of legend in London society. Immensely wealthy, politically powerful, and notoriously selective in his social engagements, he rarely attended functions of this nature. His presence at a minor auction house was so unexpected as to be nearly inexplicable. Yet here he stood, his entire bearing radiating the kind of authority that came from generations of unquestioned power. Gareth had rallied, attempting to regain his footing. "Your Grace is mistaken," he had said, forcing confidence into his voice. "Eleanor and I have a history. I was simply offering to restore what she has lost. We all know the Hartley family's circumstances. My proposal is generous beyond anything else she could hope for." The Duke had moved closer, each step measured and deliberate, until he stood between Eleanor and Gareth, a physical barrier as effective as any wall. "Miss Hartley's circumstances," he had said, his voice dangerously soft, "are irrelevant to the fundamental principle that human beings, particularly ladies of quality and character, are not commodities to be bartered over in public spaces. Your proposal was not generous. It was insulting, degrading, and quite possibly the most vulgar display I have witnessed in a decade of enduring London society's excesses." Eleanor had felt something shifting in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of despair that had been choking her. This stranger, this Duke she had never met, was defending her with a ferocity that no one, not even her own father, had ever shown on her behalf. "I'll pay triple," Gareth had said suddenly, desperation making his voice harsh. £30,000, Your Grace. Surely even you can see the generosity of such an offer." The Duke's expression had not changed, though something cold and dangerous had flickered in those grey eyes. "You appear to be labouring under a fundamental misunderstanding, Watts," he had said. "So allow me to clarify. Miss Hartley is not for sale. Not for £30,000, not for £300,000, not for any sum you could name or imagine." He had turned slightly, addressing the assembled onlookers. "Let it be known," he had continued, his voice carrying easily through the silent space, "that Miss Eleanor Hartley is under my protection. Any further attempts to harass, intimidate, or demean her will be treated as a personal affront to me and to my house." The declaration had sent another wave of shock through the crowd. For the Duke of Millbrook to publicly place someone under his protection was unprecedented, particularly someone of Eleanor's reduced circumstances. Gareth had stood frozen, his face pale, clearly recognising that he had badly miscalculated. "Your Grace," he had stammered. "I meant no offence." "Then you are a fool as well as a boor," the Duke had replied flatly. "Miss Hartley ended your engagement for excellent reasons, which your behaviour tonight has amply confirmed. You will leave now, and you will not approach her again." Gareth had bowed stiffly, shot Eleanor a look that combined humiliation and fury, and departed without another word. The Duke had turned to Eleanor, his expression softening fractionally. "Miss Hartley," he had said quietly, "are you quite well?" She had not been well. She had been shaking, her mind reeling from the violence of emotion that had torn through her. Yet some instinct for self-preservation had allowed her to nod. "Yes, Your Grace," she had managed. "Thank you for your intervention." He had offered his arm with careful courtesy. "Allow me to escort you from this place," he had said. "I believe you have endured quite enough public attention for one evening." Together they had walked through the parted crowd, out into the cool night air of London's streets. The Duke's carriage had been waiting, magnificent with its crest emblazoned on the door. He had followed her inside, settling onto the seat opposite her. "Your Grace," she had said, her hands twisting together in her lap, "I do not understand what just occurred. Why did you intervene for someone you do not even know?" The Duke had been silent for a moment. "Because I have some familiarity with being treated as a commodity rather than a person," he had said quietly. "Because I recognised in your eyes the same trapped desperation I once felt when others sought to dictate my existence. And because no woman should be subjected to what you endured tonight." Eleanor had stared at him, trying to reconcile this admission of vulnerability with the powerful figure who had faced down Gareth with such devastating effectiveness. "Where am I taking you?" he had asked. Eleanor had given him the address of her modest lodgings, watching for any sign of judgment. She had seen neither, only a slight nod. They had ridden in silence before she found courage to ask. "Your Grace, what did you mean when you said I was under your protection?" "It means you are no longer alone in facing whatever challenges your circumstances have created," he had said carefully. "It means I will use my name, my position, and my resources to ensure you are treated with respect. It means men like Gareth Watts will think twice before attempting to harass you." "But we are strangers," Eleanor had protested. "Why would you do such a thing?" "Perhaps it is simply that I saw in you something I recognize, a determination to maintain dignity in circumstances that would crush a lesser spirit. Or perhaps, Miss Hartley, it is simply that I wished to do so." The carriage had stopped at her lodgings. On the pavement, he had retained her hand for a moment. "Miss Hartley, I shall call on you tomorrow at 2 o'clock. We have much to discuss regarding your situation." Before Eleanor could protest, he had bowed, returned to his carriage, and departed into the night. At precisely 2 o'clock the next day, a liveried footman announced that His Grace awaited her in his carriage below. He had thought she might prefer to take a drive through the park rather than receive him in her rooms. The consideration had made Eleanor's throat tight. She descended to find the Duke standing beside his carriage. "Good afternoon, Miss Hartley," he had greeted her. "I hope you rested adequately." As they began their journey to Hyde Park, he spoke. "You must have questions. Please, ask them freely." "Very well, Your Grace," she had said. "What do you expect from me in exchange for this protection?" His expression had shifted. "You believe there must be an exchange. That is understandable given your experience with Watts. But I expect nothing beyond your agreement to allow me to assist you in rebuilding a secure life. But surely you must want something." He had been silent for a moment. "5 years ago, I lost someone I cared for deeply." She was a woman of considerable strength, trapped in a situation where those qualities were seen as liabilities. "I was unable to help her then. When I saw you last night, I saw an opportunity to act as I failed to act before." The honesty had stolen Eleanor's breath. The carriage had entered Hyde Park, suddenly surrounded by other vehicles. "People will see us," Eleanor had said urgently. "They will speculate." "Let them," he had replied calmly. "By tomorrow, all of London will know you are under my protection. That is precisely the point." When they left the park, the Duke directed his driver to an elegant townhouse in Mayfair. "To see my aunt," he explained. "Lady Millbrook is a formidable woman who has agreed to serve as your sponsor and chaperone." Lady Millbrook had been perhaps 70, her white hair arranged elaborately, her shrewd blue eyes missing nothing. "Sit down, child, and tell me about yourself," she had commanded. "Do not bother with false modesty." Eleanor had told her everything: her father's financial disaster, her broken engagement, her mother's retreat to Scotland, her current work at the auction house. "You have maintained your dignity despite considerable adversity," Lady Millbrook had pronounced finally. "That is worth more than any dowry." She had turned to her nephew. "You intend to restore this young woman's position. Miss Hartley, you will move into this house tomorrow," Lady Millbrook had said. "I shall provide you with wardrobe, instruction, and introductions. In return, you will work diligently and you will not embarrass my nephew. Can you agree?" "I can, my lady," Eleanor had said, tears threatening. "I give you my word that I shall prove worthy of your faith." That evening, as Alexander's carriage carried her back to her lodgings, she had spoken. "Your Grace, I still do not fully understand why you are doing this, but I shall never forget your kindness." "Miss Hartley," he had said, his voice low and intent, "I am acting on an instinct that told me you were worth knowing, worth protecting, worth bringing into my life." Her breath had caught. Your Grace, she had begun, but he had raised a hand gently. Alexander, he had said, when we are private, I should very much like you to call me Alexander. Alexander, she had repeated. He had smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his austere features. Much better. And I shall call you Eleanor. Tomorrow begins your new life, Eleanor. I hope you will find it worth the discomfort of change. The transformation of Eleanor Hartley over the following weeks became the talk of London society. Under Lady Millbrook's exacting tutelage, she had blossomed, discovering reserves of confidence she had forgotten during her years of poverty. The mornings began early with instruction. You walk as though you are apologising for taking up space, Lady Millbrook had observed. A woman of quality moves through the world as though she has every right to be wherever she chooses. The lessons covered everything from proper forms of address to the intricate politics of seating arrangements. Eleanor absorbed it all with focused intensity. The afternoons often brought Alexander, who called with remarkable regularity. He had taken Eleanor on carefully orchestrated outings where they could be seen together in settings that emphasized culture rather than scandal. Yet, despite the public nature of these excursions, Eleanor had found herself growing increasingly comfortable in his presence, their conversations ranging far beyond safe topics. You have strong views on the education of women, he had observed one afternoon at the British Museum. Adequate for producing ornamental wives, perhaps, Eleanor had replied boldly, but entirely inadequate for developing the full capabilities of half the population. Alexander had smiled. I find myself in complete agreement, which is why I serve as a patron for several schools dedicated to providing broader education to young women. Perhaps you might be interested in visiting one? The suggestion had planted a seed. With Alexander's encouragement, she had begun visiting the schools, speaking with teachers and students, developing ideas about how education might be expanded. It had given her a sense of purpose that had been absent since her father's death. Yet, even as Eleanor's confidence grew, she could not escape shadows of her past. Gareth Watts had not approached her directly, but she heard reports of his spreading rumours about her relationship with the Duke. He implies that you are the Duke's mistress, Lady Millbrook had informed her bluntly, that your restoration is payment for services rendered. Then perhaps I should withdraw from society again, Eleanor had said quietly. Nonsense, Lady Millbrook had replied. However, she had added, it would help if we could arrange a more permanent solution. Have you considered what you truly want, child? The question had haunted Eleanor into the evening, when Alexander arrived to escort her to a ball at the home of Lord and Lady Davis. She had worn a gown of deep blue silk, and for the first time in years she had seen someone worthy of standing beside a duke. Yet, as their carriage rolled through London streets, Eleanor had been unable to shake her growing awareness of her own feelings. What did she want? She wanted Alexander to look at her not as a project, but as a woman worthy of genuine affection. She wanted the right to touch his hand without excuse. She wanted, God help her, to be loved by a man who had shown her nothing but kindness. You are very quiet this evening, Alexander had observed. Are you unwell? Just nervous, Eleanor had replied. I have not attended a ball of this magnitude since my debut season. You shall be magnificent, he had said with quiet confidence, and I shall remain at your side. They arrived at the Davis mansion ablaze with light. Together they ascended the stairs to be announced. The Duke of Millbrook and Miss Eleanor Hartley, the butler proclaimed. They made their way through the ballroom, Alexander greeting acquaintances while keeping Eleanor close. Several ladies had approached to claim Eleanor for conversation. Then she had caught sight of Gareth across the room, watching her with oppressive intensity. Eleanor, Alexander had said quietly, shall we dance? The waltz had been a revelation. He moved with effortless grace, guiding her through the patterns with confident precision. They had danced in comfortable silence before he spoke. Eleanor, there is something I must tell you. Gareth has been attempting to discredit you through carefully planted rumours. And has he succeeded in damaging your reputation? To hell with my reputation, Alexander had said with sudden heat. I care nothing for what gossips say, but I will not allow him to continue harassing you. What do you propose? He had been silent for a moment, his grey eyes searching hers. Marry me, he had said simply. Marry me and put an end to all speculation. Become my Duchess. Eleanor had stumbled. You cannot mean that. I cannot allow you to sacrifice yourself for my reputation. And if it were not merely convenience, he had asked quietly, if I told you these weeks have been the happiest I can recall in 5 years, I am asking because I have fallen in love with you, with your strength and dignity. I cannot imagine my future without you. She had opened her mouth to respond when a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. Gareth Watts had moved toward them, his face flushed with champagne and anger. Millbrook, Gareth had called. A word, if you please. Alexander had moved immediately to place himself between Eleanor and Gareth. You are drunk, Watts. Remove yourself before you cause a scene. Too late for that, Gareth had replied bitterly. I know what she is to you. Everyone knows, even if they're too polite to say it. Say plainly what you mean, Alexander had commanded dangerously, or withdraw your insinuations. She's your mistress, Millbrook. Everyone knows it. You've set her up in your aunt's house. But we all know what services she provides. The slap had come from an unexpected source. Eleanor had moved around Alexander before he could stop her, her hand connecting with Gareth's face with a crack that echoed through the silent ballroom. How dare you, she had said, her voice shaking with rage. How dare you presume to know anything about my character? You, who tried to purchase me like furniture, you are not fit to speak my name. Then Alexander had spoken, his voice carrying clearly. Miss Hartley is correct, which is why I take great pleasure in announcing publicly what I had intended to share more privately. Miss Eleanor Hartley has agreed to become my wife, my Duchess. The announcement will appear in tomorrow's papers. Any further slander will be treated as a personal insult to my house. Gareth had stood frozen, pale beneath Eleanor's slap, clearly recognizing that he had badly overplayed his hand. I did not, Eleanor had begun, turning to Alexander in confusion, but he had silenced her gently. You were about to answer my proposal, he had murmured. I apologize for the precipitate announcement, but it seemed the most effective way to end Watts's harassment. So tell me, Eleanor, will you have me? She had looked up at him, this powerful man who had defended her at every turn. Yes, she had said clearly. Yes, Alexander, I will marry you. Not because of gossip, but because I have fallen in love with you as well. He had kissed her there in the Davis ballroom, in full view of London's elite. The assembled guests had broken into spontaneous applause. Gareth had fled. Later that night, Lady Millbrook had appeared in Eleanor's doorway. My dear child, surely you must have realized Alexander's feelings were engaged. I have not seen him so animated since Catherine. Who was Catherine? Eleanor had asked. Lady Millbrook had been silent for a long moment. Catherine Morland was the woman Alexander loved 5 years ago. She was married to an elderly baron, trapped in a union arranged when she was 17. Alexander met her at a house party, and they fell deeply in love. He wanted to help her escape, but Catherine's husband discovered their attachment and moved her to Cornwall. Within a year, she had died, officially of influenza, but Alexander believes the loss of hope contributed. Eleanor had felt her throat tighten. That is why he intervened when he saw me with Gareth. Yes, but Eleanor, what began as atonement has become something else entirely. Alexander does not see Catherine when he looks at you. He sees you. A week before the wedding, Mrs. Catherine Watts had called. She had known Catherine Morland and had been with her during her final illness. She had brought a letter Catherine had written for Alexander to receive upon his marriage. When Alexander had read the letter, he had wept openly. Catherine had written of her joy that he had found love again. her blessing upon his union, her wish that he would love his new wife without reservation or guilt. "You already have," he had told Eleanor, pulling her into his arms. "These weeks with you have shown me it is possible to love again, without betraying what came before." The wedding at St. George's Church had been attended by half of London's society. Eleanor had processed down the aisle on Lady Millbrook's arm, her gaze fixed on Alexander waiting at the altar. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, when Alexander kissed her, Eleanor had felt tears escaping despite her determination to remain composed. The months following their return from Italy had settled into contented rhythm. Eleanor had thrown herself into learning about the Millbrook properties, and her work with girls' schools had expanded. Yet the greatest surprise had been the depth of happiness she found in private moments, the conversations stretching into night, the physical intimacy that had grown into something precious. 4 months into their marriage, Eleanor had told Alexander she was with child. He had knelt beside her chair. "Your safety matters more to me than any heir. Promise me you will tell me if you need anything." Their daughter had been born on a spring morning. Alexander had wept when the midwife placed the baby in his arms. "She is perfect," he had whispered. They named her Catherine Eleanor, a tribute to past and present both. And when Gareth Watts finally departed England for America, Eleanor had felt only distant satisfaction. Lady Millbrook had survived to see her great-niece's first birthday. She had passed peacefully a week later, her final words a reminder to Eleanor to never forget her worth. Standing now in the nursery at Millbrook Manor, watching her daughter toddle toward her, Eleanor marvelled at how completely her life had changed. Alexander appeared in the doorway. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Choosing me?" "Every day I wake beside you," he said. "I thank whatever fate brought you into that auction house. You were never for sale, Eleanor. But if you had been, no price would have been sufficient, because your worth cannot be quantified or purchased. It can only be recognized, honored, and cherished. Dear listener, perhaps you have felt as Eleanor once did, as though your worth is determined by others' assessments, as though your past has defined your future in ways you cannot escape. Perhaps you have stood frozen while others tried to reduce you to a transaction. The story of Eleanor and Alexander reminds us that our worth is inherent, not assigned, that we are not commodities to be purchased, but people to be honored, that the past, however painful, need not dictate the future, that love, when genuine, sees us truly and empowers us to become everything we were meant to be. You are not for sale at any price. You are beyond price, precious and irreplaceable, deserving of love that recognizes rather than rescues, that partners rather than purchases, that builds together rather than demands surrender. Tonight, rest knowing that your story is still being written, that unexpected interventions can change everything, that the auction houses of our lives, where we feel assessed and diminished, can become the places where we are truly seen for the first time. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing for more tales of unexpected love and transformation. Comment below with where you are listening from, and know that wherever you are valued beyond measure. Until next time, may you recognize your own worth and surround yourself with those who honor it as you deserve.